This is Dan, and this is the Napkin Academy. And today's lesson is a big one. Today is the acid test of putting into play the entire visual thinking codex, seeing if we can understand exactly how to use this tool that helps us look both across and deep within a problem. And the problem that we're going to look at is a big one, and it relates to healthcare. So I need to make a little bit of an announcement right up front, and I think it's pretty exciting. In the 10 days since I've launched the Napkin Academy, we've had cadets. That is, some of you who are listening to this sign up from 43 different countries around the world, which I think is just incredible. I am amazed and excited by the kind of global reach we've been able to have with our simple pictures. And the reason I bring that up is because for the lesson that we're going to talk about today, I'm going to focus on something that's taking place in the United States. So I just want to let you know, all of you that are dialing in from abroad, totally aware of the fact that things that happen in the United States might not be of the most interest to you, but at the same time, I think that the lesson that I want to share with you today is one that's pretty fascinating, has a pretty significant global impact in terms of all kinds of ways of thinking, and in particular is a really powerful example of the kinds of problems we can solve by putting our minds into visual gear and drawing things out. So the problem that we're going to look at as we go through this lesson is one about defining healthcare. What is healthcare, and in particular, what does healthcare reform mean? Now, of course, there is a bit of a political subtext behind everything whenever we're going to start talking about healthcare. My intent in this lesson is not to go into anything about the politics, but simply to be able to show how something as complex, as snarly, as laden with nuances and meaning as healthcare is, can still be clarified through the use of our simple pictures. So the problem goes back to when President Obama was running for president back in the year of 2008, and among other things that he promised to deliver on if he were elected were all kinds of issues around, of course, the economy, political change, and of course, one of the big ones was about healthcare reform, which has been an issue in American political circles for well over 100 years. So one of the things that President Obama promised that he would deliver on would be reform of the American healthcare system. And unfortunately, when he began to put into place various issues of policy, what happened is that the United States, for various reasons, really started to rip itself apart from a debate perspective on trying to understand what is it that healthcare reform is really about. So the real issue is, what kind of a problem is it? Is it a problem of who and what? Well, yes, it is, because there's a lot of players that are involved. Is it a problem of how much? Well, yes, it is, because there's a tremendous amount of money involved. Is it a problem of where? Well, yes, it is, because it's a problem of both where within the country geographically and where conceptually it is that all the people and the pieces and the money are going to fit. And is it a when problem? Of course it is, because when do we need to do this? Well, apparently we need to do it soon. Is it a how problem? Absolutely, because a lot has to do with execution. How are we going to put into play whatever it is that the policies? And is there a why problem? Well, of course there's that too, because we want to know, well, why do we need to reform anything? And at the same time, that's taking it up and down across our 6x6. As we look across our codex and we think horizontally, is this a problem that we can solve simply? No, but we better be able to come up with a way to talk about it simply. Is it a quantitative problem or a qualitative problem? Well, again, it's both. So here's what we want to do. This is our central exercise to go back to everything about visual problem solving. We have to understand which problem is it that we're looking at. And I believe that the real problem to be addressed is a problem of vision. What I mean by that is, do we know what healthcare reform is, and do we know what it would look like? And I think the problem that we face, first off, is defining the vision, and then the definition, and then we will be able to go in to explore all the other details. So my point is, we're going to use the codex to both explore horizontally across these with a focus on vision, and vertically across all of our various picture types. So the way I wanted to start this is as a consultant, There I am over there. I've had an opportunity to work with a lot of different businesses and organizations, but I am not an expert in healthcare reform. No way. But one of the beauties about being a consultant is you meet lots of smart people, and I thought, well, if we're going to try to use pictures to solve some of these problems, I better get an expert in here. So I thought of a friend of mine, a guy named Dr. Tony Jones, probably one of the smartest consultants I've ever worked with. Tony is an MD and has a tremendous business background, and Tony has worked with every healthcare company in America just about. Tony understands the system. So what I did is I said, Tony, let's draw our pictures, because here's what's happening. If you look at what's coming out of Washington, you see a tremendous amount of written documentation. This is the actual first piece of healthcare legislation law that was passed, and there's going to be a lot of words in here. And what we're looking for, remember, is the vision. We want to know, what is the vision? What does healthcare look like now, so that we can compare it to what healthcare might look like in the future? If this is what we have now, and this is what we're going to have in the future, I want to be able to see that picture, and I'm not going to find it in this document. And the proof of that is in looking at the rest of the document, because look what we have. Thousands and thousands of pages of bullet points and lists and not a single picture. So one group on the pro-reform side thought that they'd put together some pictures that try to explain things from a simple perspective, and another group that was opposed to healthcare reform put together some pictures that showed from their perspective how incredibly complicated everything would be. And in the end, we end up with a huge mess of a total lack of understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So that's the problem that we set out to fix. I believe that if we do it effectively, if we can solve a definition of what healthcare is, and we can solve a definition of what clarity is, if we solve for one, if we can effectively define healthcare, we will have solved for the other. So as we look at it, we touched on this already, we try to figure out what kind of a problem do we have. And as we've pointed out, we've got aspects in healthcare reform of all of the 6 major types. So what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up drawing a portrait, we're going to end up drawing a chart, we're probably going to draw some maps, we're probably going to draw some timelines, we're probably going to draw some flow charts, and in the end we may end up drawing some multivariable plots, and if not, certainly we're going to end up drawing our vision picture as well. There is the additional issue of such a wide variety of audiences that whatever this vision is has to be able to address. So let's think about it from the perspective of the policymakers. Whatever they're going to try to describe about healthcare reform is going to have to be understood by this group and their parents. It's going to have to be understood by people who are absolute experts in the field of healthcare. It's going to have to be understood by people who are experts in the field of finance and in business. And it's going to have to be understood by people who have a personal and invested interest in understanding the finance and the money and the people that are involved. So all of these audiences are going to have to be addressed by whatever this vision is, which brings us to, of course, the squid. Remember how we use the squid. The squid helps us identify who are our audiences and what picture types might we want to make to most effectively address them, whether simple or elaborate, and so on. So again, we're going to need to do both the vertical and the horizontal analysis, which is exactly why we need the codex. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a series of pictures erring on the side of the simple, given the wide range of audiences that we have, and erring on the side of giving us a vision. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with our portraits, and we're going to come up with a simple portrait that hopefully leads us to a simple vision picture, and then we're going to work our way down through the codex, generating many different pictures as we go to see if we can't define this issue of healthcare reform in a way that we can look at and visually make sense to us. So let's go ahead, clean off the codex, and start over. What's the first picture we're going to draw? A who and a what portrait, and what we're going to try to do is draw a simple one. That's going to be our starting point. So let's do that. Who and what? Who is the first person that is involved in any kind of a healthcare related question? Well, it is the patient. So someone who's sick. And let's say in this case that that patient is, let's say this is my mom. and she's not happy. But my mom is just the first person in the whole equation. If we continue thinking about all of the other who's that are involved in healthcare, we end up with quite a list. We end up, of course, with the patient's family, a doctor, a general practitioner, a doctor specialist, perhaps another specialist, certainly a nurse and other assistants that will work in the hospitals, laboratory technicians, pharmacists, emergency medical technicians, clerks within hospitals and pharmaceutical companies and clinics, people who are involved in insurance, and of course then politicians. So for our first portrait, remember what we wanted to do was create a simple one. I think this may be too elaborate. Even though we've accounted for just about everybody, at least on first blush, who's involved in healthcare, it's still too elaborate. We need to start out with something that's a little bit simpler. So let's draw a simpler view of who's involved, and let's just focus on the most key individuals, the patient, the doctor, and let's go from there. So we start out with the patient. This is me, and I'm sick, so I'm unhappy. I am who number one. But I'm not the only person involved in the simplest possible who picture, because my doctor is also involved and the insurance company is also involved. The person who's providing me with health and the person who's processing the money. So there are actually three of us that are involved. So our first portrait, our first simple portrait, involves these three characters: 1, 2, and 3. Well, let's now start to think about where these characters sit. So we're going to talk now about a bit of a map. So if we look at what does a map show us? The map shows us the position, conceptual or real or geographic, of where the who's actually sit, where they are. So where they are is that over time what's happened is that there is a relationship between me and my doctor that is a relationship of health, but the insurance company who pays for it has actually moved to a position in between me and my healthcare provider, meaning the insurance company becomes in many ways the decision maker on how much money will be spent on which treatment for me, and ends up being the one that pays much to the doctor. So the insurer, from a map perspective, sitting in the middle. Well, let's draw a better map to show what that looks like. We actually end up with something that looks kind of like a balance. The business of healthcare in the United States is actually two different businesses: the business of the providers and the business of the payers, the people who make us well and the people who process the money. There's more to this map, of course. We have to add ourselves in the middle with our money. So conceptually now we're starting to build the map that shows the underpinnings of the American healthcare system. Now let's explore this map a little bit further. When I'm healthy, when I'm feeling good, my insurance company is very happy with me because they are collecting my money, and rightfully they are earning their profit without having to spend any of that money. They love it when I'm healthy. When I'm healthy, my doctor is happy for me personally, but at kind of a level we're never really allowed to talk about, is maybe not so happy because in a profit-driven business they're not making any money, so they're not happy. When I'm sick, it's a terrible way to put it, but from a financial perspective, my healthcare provider loves me because now I'm paying money to them in order to make me well. But when I'm sick, my insurance company does not like me at all because now they have to take some of the money they were collecting and pay it out. So in the end, what's happened over the last many years in the United States is that these two businesses have come to really detest each other because both of them rightfully are trying to maximize their profit, rightfully in our system, maximize their profit off of the amount of money that I'm putting into the system. The problem is I am the only source of money coming into this system, so as both sides seek to maximize the amount of money that they're able to collect as businesses, I am the one that's becoming increasingly squeezed. How squeezed am I? And now we're going to move into the charts. We're moving across, we're moving down the 6x6 as we're going to different picture types, and we're moving across the codex as we're moving towards the quantitative and still staying on the simple. We want to draw a chart that shows some of the numbers. So if we just picked one of the who's, if we just picked the insurance companies and looked at how much. Well, it turns out that insurance companies have been quite profitable. And if you look at 2008 annual profit for the three biggest insurance companies in the United States, you'll see that they were quite profitable. So that's part of the how much. Another part of the how much, though, is how much is it costing the economy and individuals to be able to pay for the profitability of the insurance companies and of the medical providers. And it turns out that if we look at those charts, we see that the national cost of health expenses per person is going up dramatically, and the percent of the entire gross domestic product that's dedicated towards health insurance costs is also going up. And if one were to continue to plot this chart out, you'd see that it doesn't take long before the costs to individuals becomes unsustainable. This is the situation we find ourselves in now. So our when question, very simple timeline, would say, yesterday we had a certain amount of money going into healthcare, and tomorrow we're probably going to have an unsustainable amount of money going into healthcare. So the time to make some kind of change, at least according to this administration, is right now. Pretty simple when picture. So how are they going to do it? Well, if you were to read the actual legislation, which again, Tony and I did, we realized that the how, the process is the government looks at this administration looks at this balance and says, it's time for me to step in and try to help out these people by somehow balancing out the fact that both sides of this equation are squishing me down, and see if we can't relieve some of the cost burden. And so government, in this case, this administration, looks at this balance. And if you're to look at the healthcare reform package, most of the reform actually takes place on the insurance side of the equation. Most of the laws and regulations say we're actually going to reform how insurance handles the money. How are we going to do that? And now we start to map out the flow charts that show how the government, how this administration looks at this model and begins to map out the various options for changing the underlying structure. And if we were to create this kind of a spectrum, we would see that all of the various reform legislation pieces proposed by anybody in any level of the political spectrum fall across a pretty simple map. Today, we have fairly restrictive private insurance models. Some of the more conservative members of Congress say one of the things that we could do is perhaps make less restrictive but still private insurance. Some of the more middle-of-the-road, slightly progressive politicians say, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we kept private insurance, but we also added in some kind of private co-ops, which are a way to be able to relieve some of the cost for people. Some of the more liberal or progressive members of Congress and the government are looking and saying, well, maybe we should reduce the amount of private insurance and create some kind of public insurance that would be able to help minimize the cost. And at the extreme progressive side, there was actually in the beginning of this debate the notion of talking about an entirely public insurance program, but that was dismissed fairly rapidly as something that would not be palatable at all to the American public. So that was the spectrum of options we had by which to make our decision of how might we go about making underlying reform issues to politics. Which brings us to the last question of why would we want to reform the healthcare equation at all? Well, we saw the numbers, we saw the people, we saw the trends, and in the end, why and why now is because the goal for everybody is to try to create quality, affordable care for all citizens, which is why we want to talk about healthcare reform. Now, those are the pictures that I think did a pretty interesting job of helping to clarify the definition of the vision. And I'm not going to say that those pictures solved it, but they certainly clarified it. So with that vision clarified, now all we need to do is simply do it. Make policy and execute. And of course, in order to do that, I would suggest that the powers that be continue to draw out their pictures and now move from the simple towards the elaborate, looking again into the quantitative, looking more into the details of comparing various options, looking into making more detailed timelines of how we're going to do it, flow charts of exactly what are the steps that would be needed, and etc., creating the various types of pictures that we need throughout the codex to begin to move from having to find the vision towards moving towards everything else that's necessary to make it happen. Well, now, having taken you through that use of the codex, I want to share with you the result of this particular study, at least as it impacted me. Here's what happened. I drew that series of pictures with Tony Jones. We took those series of pictures, those simple little drawings, the same ones that I just showed you, and we created 40 some of those pictures, and I posted them on a website called SlideShare. Something really incredible happened. Within a matter of weeks, we had over 500,000 downloads of what is effectively a PowerPoint presentation about healthcare. And if you think about it, what could be more boring on earth than that? And all of a sudden, 500,000 people are taking the time to download these pictures and look through them. And then comments start to come in and people uniformly say, thank you for having clarified the debate. From a non-political perspective, I now feel better informed to go ahead and make my own opinion from a political perspective on how I feel about healthcare reform. And then the slides got picked up by the online news service, the Huffington Post, and then went really viral, getting more and more and more views. And it wasn't long after that I actually got a telephone call from the producers of Fox News, one of the biggest broadcasters in the United States, who said, Dan, since you are clearly one of America's leading authorities on healthcare reform, would you be willing to come on air and share your drawings of what healthcare reform really means? And I said, absolutely. So I was able to have my 7 minutes of national broadcast television to be able to share my simple little pictures of what healthcare reform might mean. It wasn't long after that I received an invitation from another organization to come in and share my ideas. I did receive an email and a call from the White House saying, Dan, given what you've explained about healthcare reform with your simple pictures, would you be willing to come in and share some of those ideas with us here in the White House? And so I was able to say yes, and that is the real story that I want to share with you. That is how we use all of the visual thinking tools I've shared with you up to this point, especially as they relate to putting them together in the codex. We define our problem. We break it down into the 6 elemental pictures, and then we move across the squid, deciding which type of picture is going to be the best, creating the series of pictures that help us explain and clarify, pictorially solving our problem. Which brings us to the conclusion of everything that I know about the codex, at least for now. And again, to summarize, we've got our 6x6, ask yourself the 6 questions. Then we've got our squid. Ask yourself which pictures might be the best flavor of each of those to draw. Go ahead and begin drawing out your pictures across the squid, and I guarantee it, before too long, you will begin to see your problem coming together. So the assignment that I'd like to leave with you, and this is again an advanced lesson, this may take some time, is go ahead and pick a big, scary problem, one that you've been facing either in business or in life. Go ahead and use the codex to map out as many of the pictures as you think necessary to begin to clarify the problem for you and begin to come up with your solution. Go ahead.